And what I encourage for my own patients too is, okay, this is my set of recommendations, but I want you to listen to your body. Right? And to be able to discern over time what is kind of a detox reaction, right? And what is, wait a minute, this is not working for me.
Before we get into how you healed yourself from this autoimmune condition, let's just start, from the beginning. Like, at what point in your life did you realize something was wrong? And, what was your early symptomology like?
Thank you. It's, hindsight's always 20/20, so I wouldn't even know really where to begin. But I'll say, I knew something was amiss shortly after I became a new mother. My daughter was 4 months old, and I started having a lot of very uncomfortable and kind of frightening symptoms. Heart racing, feeling like I was going to pass out, a lot of shortness of breath. I just felt exhausted. I wasn't sleeping well. But I would say things kind of got acute at that point. And that's when I was diagnosed with an autoimmune thyroid condition, postpartum thyroiditis, which is the postpartum form of a more commonly heard one called Hashimoto's. So but in hindsight, I had a lot of other symptoms that were out of balance for a long time. Even during residency training, where people are usually exhausted, working 36-hour shifts and then going home post-call exhausted and crashing and sleeping, like I wasn't able to sleep, So in hindsight, again, my muscles would feel very achy and sore, like I had just run a marathon. So in hindsight, I've been having some autoimmune, or maybe we'll call it inflammatory, symptoms, some signs and symptoms of my stress hormone axis not being in balance. So, I think the tipping point for me was the pregnancy and then childbirth, which, very, very commonly can be a period where autoimmune conditions either flare up or they subside, right? With the large fluctuations in hormones, the immune system can undergo tremendous flux. So I was diagnosed, shortly after I became a new mother. So I was early 30s. And, I did what any good doctor patient would do. I sought out the top-notch specialist in my area. And not just an endocrinologist, but an endocrinologist who specialized, his whole life work was thyroid disease. So I went that route, got medication. Unlike Hashimoto's, kind of the non-postpartum form of this autoimmune condition, most postpartum forms will resolve. And so I kind of, in my mind, knew, this is kind of longer term, but it's not probably lifelong. After a year, my blood work normalized, and I was able to taper off of the medication. I still did not feel well, but by my doctor's book and by my own book, I was cured because my numbers looked great. So I continued living my life, and I was still living a very full life. And I think I was just drawing on reserves. And it was, I had a very dramatic turning point, which was when my daughter, my first child, was 2 years old, and my husband and she and I went and we took a trip to Beijing. My parents had moved back there. I grew up in Texas, and they had moved back there for many years, and I had visited numerous times. Back there, I had an episode, some might call it a near-death experience. Basically, I lost consciousness. And when I came to, I was in an emergency room. That was kind of the beginning of a very dramatic beginning to chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic vertigo with dysautonomia, which is when the autonomic nervous system is very uncoordinated. So,
how does that manifest when the autonomic, because when I think of the autonomic nervous system, I think of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, sort of the yin and yang aspect to the nervous system. So how does that manifest in terms of like how you were feeling?
Yeah, it can manifest in a lot of different ways. I forget now how many different forms of dysautonomia there are, but I think 6 or 7, something like that.
Wow.
The most well-known one is called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome, which is, I mean, I hear it all the time now. It's very prevalent, especially emerging in young women.
Mm.
So, but always feeling like you're kind of on the verge of passing out. For me, a lot of it was vertigo. Racing heart, sitting down, feeling calm, and suddenly the heart rate shoots up. As you well know, it affects the brain, it affects digestion, breathing rate. So it's just this lived sense of having absolutely no control. You feel a lot like you're at the mercy of whatever the nervous system is going to do. So that together with the real severe exhaustion of chronic fatigue syndrome, flu-like exhaustion, kept me housebound actually for the next, almost decade. And I should also mention that part of this very dramatic episode in Beijing was also the beginning of my second pregnancy. So there was this. There was again a huge flux in hormones, right, which was happening. Again, in hindsight, having later on gone into integrative and functional medicine and really trying to understand root causes, probably right. I had pre-existing autoimmunity that wasn't resolved. I go into a second pregnancy, huge shift in hormones. I did have some kind of gastrointestinal virus, and I know that because my husband and my daughter had it too. And then, so we have the infection and then also probably just lots of pollutants, being in Beijing. So kind of that perfect storm was the beginning of this next leg of my journey.
It's fascinating and shocking at the same time. I mean, I think a lot of people would assume that somebody as highly credentialed as you wouldn't be subjected to the same kind of fog of war that chronic illness presents with, because you have all this training and knowledge under your belt. But when dealing with these kinds of illnesses, it sounds like you were just as mystified as anybody else would be.
Oh, I was just as mystified. And, I have to say, Max, I mean, it was incredibly humbling because, somewhere in my psyche, I felt like I was immune, not even so much because of the knowledge that I had, but that somehow the knowledge, not that the knowledge would get me out of it. It was that somehow the knowledge was going to protect me. Like I'm on this side of the bedside, right? And my patients are on the other side. So there was a sense of immunity. I mean, literally, kind of pun intended, a real immunity to it. It was humbling to be suddenly a patient that, Western medicine, that my own paradigm had no answers for, but also the stigma that goes along with it as well. And the stigma was, of being a difficult patient, of, was this some, was I somaticizing? Was it anxiety? Was it depression? And sure, I had anxiety, and sure, I had depression. And I also knew that there was something deeper. So I could see in the doctors I was consulting, I could see in their eyes the judgment, this isn't really going on. But I also had that towards myself. And I think that that's what was hard for me. It's not like that. Of course, everyone has their own journey. I know other doctor patients who didn't go into that place of severe self, criticism and judgment. But I just, I had that mentality, like I just need to put my mind over matter and push past this. And I could not. So it took me, a couple of years of just really running into a wall and suffering enough to say, oh, you know what, maybe I got to step out of this paradigm. And I couldn't even see beyond it, right? That paradigm was my whole worldview. It wasn't just medicine. That's how I really interfaced with the world. So it was not an enlightening moment for me. It was one of real desperation. So I was too tired to hold on, and I, kind of was forced to surrender and to try differently.
Wow. So then what were some of those early steps that you began to take when trying to see what was behind the veil if the Western paradigm ceased to provide you or was unable to provide you with the answers that you sought?
Yeah, I mean, my very first step was again, I mean, I was very much leading with my mind. So, and that was how I had to do it. It had to make sense to me. Was actually, I was cracking open my Pathology 101 textbook and trying to understand how does disease happen, right? So if you have, this was even before I had like the diagnoses officially of dysautonomia and chronic fatigue syndrome, you know, and even after that, it's like you're still in this sort of, you know, never land in between, right? Sort of what to do and what not to do. Like nobody knows. And so I just went back to basics and trying to understand how disease happens. And also in that process, understanding that we actually knew very little about health and what healing was. So that, and I think the aha moment for me was, you know, with these diagnoses and even without the diagnoses, the chronicity and the poor prognoses of these kinds of conditions can be very, very self-defeating, right? It's like you look at the stats and the vast majority of people with these syndromes don't recover or live a significantly limited life. That kind of becomes, again, your framework. So one of the things I first did was I did as much as I could to detach from that identity. Like that's not who I am. I'm a human being, right, with some imbalances. And so the Pathology 101 really helped me see that. And it's not black and white. Diagnoses are not, right? It's a continuum. So, you know, even something as black and what we think in terms of like black and white, like cancer, right? It's still a continuum, right? We've got these cancer cells, our immune system's keeping it in surveillance and keeping things in check. But at the point at which we can diagnose, we kind of say that you officially have disease. And so going into the mechanisms of disease and looking at, oh, there are causes to this, I began to sort of one by one dive into what those causes might be for me.
Wow, it's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, a diagnosis, obviously it's great when you're able to attain a diagnosis, but it can also provide a false sense of security because diagnoses don't say anything about the root cause of a condition. And so I can't even imagine what your frustration must have been like. But then, so when it comes to the root cause, you mentioned that you had gotten turned on to this concept, functional medicine. What is that all about?
Functional medicine, I mean, it was something I kind of stumbled into later when I was ready to go back into clinical medicine. I had to take a leave from work. I took a leave from work for about 3 years or so and went back very part-time. But when I was ready, you know, my kids were a little bit older. I was ready to actually apply what I had been learning on my journey to patient care. And I had no idea what that looked like, you know, because mine was like, I was stumbling around, you know, trial and error and, on diet, like going a little bit into ancestral health and then coming across gluten and its connection and dairy with the thyroid. Okay, so I got to do that. You know, it was very piecemeal. And so I began to explore different paradigms of integrative health. And I was shadowing different doctors. And one of the doctors I shadowed was an integrative, a holistic pediatrician in San Francisco. And I said, well, you know, I'm really looking for integrative, something integrative. Acupuncture had been a very big part of my healing journey as well as in the beginning. And from my acupuncturist, I learned about the importance of digestion, of gut health, you know, just kind of being that foundational piece. And also how the gut connects to the mother, you know, and to nourishment and to the land. And so I was very interested in this ecological paradigm, this paradigm that was much bigger than even myself. And how do I relate to my community? How do I relate to nature, to, you know, global health? And I was explaining this to this pediatrician, and she said, God, it sounds like you're really interested in functional medicine. So that was my intro to it. And it just happened that the Institute for Functional Medicine was putting on their foundational course the next month. And it was in Santa Monica. And that was, traveling had always been difficult for me since all this happened. And that was doable. It was just a short hop down from Northern California. And so that was my introduction. And functional medicine, I still don't think it's a great term because nobody knows what it is. But it's really root cause medicine. And maybe we can call it, the body as an ecosystem medicine. I don't know what we would call it, but really looking at us as one system that's dynamic and not just within ourselves, but in dynamic flux with all our entire cumulative environment, and understanding how stress, right, the different causes of disease. So, there's generally like 5 classes of causes of disease, right? So there's infections, allergens, inflammatory foods, toxins or pollutants, and stress. So emotional, mental, physical stress. But how do they play through our genetics and then express as a unique disease or a unique set of symptoms? And so it's, it brought me suddenly from very limited tools, right, in my doctor's bag, to something that was beautiful. It was complex, but it was also seemingly infinite in its possibilities and its different iterations, right? You talk with, you talk to all these experts, and they're going to argue, what is the best diet, and what is the best way to move, to exercise the body? And I was both enlightened and I felt incredibly confused, both as a patient who was trying to navigate, what do I need to do next? This protocol is not working, so what do I do? What do I offer my patients? Because it was also seemingly infinite in terms of the different possibilities. So that actually led me into, very reluctantly, but again, like necessity, right? Desperation just kind of breaks down doors. I moved on into, I added and brought into my life intuition and intuitive medicine. And how do we begin to marry, right? Healing is balancing, right? It's really balancing. How do we begin to balance the right side of the brain, which is so underutilized, I think, in medicine as a whole, with the left brain? And really, I see it as having 2 eyes, right? We have 2 to see deeper and to see wider. And so 2 sides of the brain, can we see what is true, like in front of us, with much more clarity? So I just began, learning that intuition is like music or art. It's, some people are born gifted. Some of us are born tone deaf, and doesn't matter. Wherever we start, we can we can practice and we can improve. So it was it was very much an intentional, after I was kind of forced into it, because I wanted to understand how to narrow down the possibilities of treatments. It became very intentional. Like, I want to develop this.
I love this concept of intuitive medicine, and I want to definitely unpack it some more. But I do want to take a step back, because I think, when we started talking about functional medicine, I do want to know about, before having discovered this concept, what were some of the things that you were learning about diet and lifestyle that helped you get the symptoms that you were bring the symptoms that you were experiencing under control?
Yeah, so I would say, like, one of the first things was actually sleep, right? Because sleep was a real challenge, and I was like, if I can't get regular sleep or more sleep or better quality sleep, then I'm not even going to have the energy to do anything else. one of the things that I learned, I mean, I knew a lot. I had, of course, already been doing like a lot of sleep hygiene. I mean, I hadn't had caffeine in I don't know how many years. Was whatever, dimming the lights down, soothing music, relaxation, all that, baths, to no avail. And I began learning about the circadian rhythm. And how actually what I did and how my body and my mind worked during the day were going to affect what was happening at night. And again, it seems so fundamental right now and so obvious, but in medicine, and I mean, I think just me as a human being, everything is very myopic, right? And if I had a symptom, I'd be like, well, what caused that? And I would just kind of look in the last, 10 minutes, last hour, maybe last half day, what must have caused that? And very often it's not that way, right? The body's responding to a whole set of different things that have happened in different layers at different times. So I began to, I need to align my body and my mind with rhythms during the day. And my relaxation stuff needs to start at the beginning of the day so that I, kind of move through my day in a different way. It began to teach me to, one of the things I dove into was qigong, which is a moving meditation, sometimes called embodied consciousness practices, but it's the foundation of Tai Chi, martial arts, traditional Chinese medicine. It is, and it's the thing with qigong is you don't even need a yoga mat, you don't need a yoga block, you don't need any props. Period. And every movement can be modified. So if I was doing it from the couch, I was doing it from the couch. If I couldn't really get out of bed, I would do it from the bed.
It's actually great for Parkinson's disease.
Oh, it's incredible. It's incredible. And, and there have been, a lot of studies looking at the benefits. And there are a lot of theories about how it works, right? In terms of what's happening. Is it modulating genes? Is it changing the way the neurons are connecting? Is it dampening inflammation? It has a positive effect on the immune system. I mean, all of these things. And as I've now been practicing very deeply for almost 8 years now, and as I continue to go deeper, it is so much, there's so much more even below the molecular level. And that's the place where I currently, we can jump to this later, but where I'm currently most interested, because that's where radical healing happens. And just as most things in life, right, it's our personal journeys that take us there. So I did have another health crisis that after which I experienced a radical healing. And so I began to go into what is that subtle energetic realm that might be able to make any healing, whether it's conventional medicine or integrated functional medicine, any healing much more efficient, much more, rapid. But going back to your question, so qigong was one of the things that helped me kind of regulate my circadian rhythm. And through that, I also began to realize, I don't have to react all the time to every single symptom. I can observe it from a little bit of a distance, but it wasn't a detachment like what we tend to do is we dissociate from our bodies because it's really frightening, it's uncomfortable. Our consciousness goes way outside of ourselves. But qigong gives us this paradigm to actually stay within our bodies, stay with the discomfort, but you can also observe the discomfort. And so, again, I think just a lot of the erratic patterns began to smooth over. The second thing that I learned on my journey when I was piecing things together was, as I mentioned earlier, I was seeing an acupuncturist. And that was also, with some, hoeing and hawing in the beginning, like, what are those needles going to do, And I had a really the first treatment I had was just like 4 tiny little needles. And I wanted more, right? I was like, no, I've been suffering a long time. I want some results. And 4 tiny little needles. And I had a major withdrawal reaction. I mean, I felt like I was detoxing from opioids. It was
Wow.
that intense. And so it scared me. It was frightening. And certainly my husband did not like that either. He's like, you are not going back to acupuncture. And when I spoke to some of my friends who knew about acupuncture, who'd been training in it, they said, oh, that's a detox reaction. That's a qi reaction. And it's a healing reaction. So the thing that made me go back was something was happening, whereas nothing had happened, to anything else really. I was trying. And it was through this acupuncturist that, he was feeling my pulse. He was telling me about my relationship with my mother, reading my, my abdominal pulse, my digestive pulse. And then he also said, you're really deficient, yin deficient, which is actually probably very most closely correlated with adrenal. My whole hormonal stress axis was deficient. And he said, what's your diet like? And this was, when I had been eating what I thought was a very healthy diet. But again, I didn't recognize sort of the one size doesn't fit all thing. I was largely organic by this point, mostly vegetables. And he said, you need a lot more meat. And it just really surprised me. He said, you need heavy foods. Like, don't do the salads. You need heavy foods, stews, soups, meaty. You know about bone broth? So it was like, and that was way before it was even, like a fad. I don't know if you can call it a fad now, but it's all over, at least Northern California. It's even in Texas. So that was the beginning of, I got to tailor this to myself, and I need to learn how to know what my body needs. And so, that then, my scientific mind I would go research things. And then that led me to the whole ancestral diet movement, right? And what did my ancestors eat? How did they cook? How did they prepare foods? And it was also another way. I mean, healing is on so many different dimensions. So it connected that together with the qigong practice, and actually going to a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, got me reconnected to my heritage. Got me connected to my family in a much deeper way, in a way that felt kind of honoring. And I didn't realize how detached I had felt. I was born and raised in the United States. And born and raised in Texas, in the heartland of Texas, which is pretty far away from the culture of even my parents, and my grandparents. So, again, that's kind of, I think, a deeper layer of healing that we sometimes can miss even in functional medicine, right? It's like really connecting to ourselves. And what does that mean?
So important. And also, I think, like, kind of counterintuitive, because I'm sure there are at least some people listening to this that are thinking, yeah, but how is feeling more connected to my family going to help treat the disease that I'm currently suffering from?
Well, I can be very clinical about it. I can say that the more we feel a sense of belonging, right? And that can be anything. It can be belonging to the earth, or it can be belonging to a family. It can be belonging to ourselves. And that the more we can rest, right? So we can really shift into this parasympathetic healing mode of resting and digesting. It's like, you know what? I'm home. Whatever. And again, it's I remember talking to a friend of mine who had done a pilgrimage, and she said she finally got to her destination, and she met this teacher this wisdom teacher she'd been seeking out, and all the way on the other side of the world in India. And she approaches him, and what does he say to her? He says, "Go home." Go home. And I remember her telling me that story, and I was just thinking, God, what is home? Right? What is home? And so, for me and for a lot of patients I work with, learning how to be at home within our own bodies is really important. And a lot of our conditioned physiological responses, stress responses, are formed before we probably were even conscious of, what was going on socially or politically or environmentally, and, formed in the home of our families. And so a lot of that healing, some people don't want to go there, and that's fine. Do they heal? Yeah, there are a lot of different ways. But often if we can go, again, deeper into the root causes and heal those, a lot more of the layers above it heal.
It is interesting. I mean, your body does want to heal, but I guess what you're saying is that healing is optimally, it's a process that occurs optimally when your body is in the parasympathetic rest and digest state. And I think we live in extremely stressful times, and a lot of the stress that we experience is self-generated. And so when you're able to disconnect from all that noise and static and reconnect to what it is that brings you joy and comfort and relaxation, it primes your body.
Absolutely.
To
Absolutely.
recover.
And I would say, to add to that, a lot of the stress that we feel or that our bodies experience is subconscious, right? They're just these conditioned patterns that, our conscious minds, we could be really relaxed and our body's still in fight or flight mode. So a lot of, and that's another dimension of qigong and other mind-body practices, helps us reconnect those circuits so that we're aware. And then, the surprising thing to me, I mean, it's not surprising if you really sit down and think about it, but as a human being living the experience, I was like, oh, my conscious mind actually can affect the subconscious patterns. I just need to learn how to do that. So, there are more spiritual roots, right? These mind-body rituals. And then there's very scientific clinical roots like neural retraining. And, a lot of programs out there that are incredibly effective for that.
Yeah. Wow. You mentioned briefly the role of gluten in thyroid health, and you were suffering from autoimmune thyroiditis and inflammation of the thyroid. But can you talk about the relationship that gluten has with thyroid health? Because it's not really an area that we've explored too deeply on the show before.
Yeah. It's, autoimmunity is, there are a few different mechanisms or general mechanisms that trigger the immune system to attack your own tissues. And one of them is what we call molecular mimicry, so that there's enough similarity in people who have certain genes, certain predispositions to where gluten actually triggers the immune system, right, to attack the thyroid gland. And so one of the things that I experienced too when I removed gluten and dairy and gluten, often there's a cross reactivity. And so, like when we look at patients with celiac disease, which is the most well studied, right, gluten induced autoimmune condition that affects generally the gut, but also affects other organs, is that there's usually about a 50 or 60% cross reactivity. So about 50 or 60% of people who are sensitive to gluten are also sensitive to dairy. And so I eliminated both of them. And similar to this acupuncture session, I had a pretty swift withdrawal. And the interesting thing is that out of all my systems that were affected, my digestion felt kind of regular to me. It felt good, balanced, and didn't have any digestive symptoms really. And then I removed gluten and dairy, and I had just horrible diarrhea for 3 or 4 days. And again, I was like, "What is this?" And then after that, it of course it settled, but again, it was a withdrawal reaction. So I'd become so tolerant to it. Yeah,
it's the first I'm ever hearing of a gluten withdrawal.
Yeah. And then we see it too, gluten and dairy too. They can affect some of the opiate receptors in the nervous system. So, and that's why for some people, it feels like a drug, right? Why it's kind of addictive and it's tranquilizing. And so coming off of it, I had another withdrawal reaction. So yeah, it was intense, but it was only a few days, maybe 5 days max. But then it began to uncover actually a lot of gut stuff, right? Began the beginning of my need to rebalance and heal the gut. But that connection between gluten and thyroid disease is so well established by mainstream science that some of I can't speak for most of them, but some of the most renowned celiac experts screen all of their patients for thyroid disease. But doctors in Western medicine being very specialized and siloed, endocrinologists don't do the reverse. Of course, it's becoming more and more common now. It's much more prevalent in terms of just information that's shared than 15 years ago. When I was really beginning the journey. But it's there. It just needs to be brought out. It needs to be illuminated.
It's my understanding that celiac disease also overlaps with other non-thyroid autoimmune conditions quite frequently. Do you know if that's the case?
Say that again?
That celiac disease overlaps with other autoimmune conditions, not necessarily autoimmune thyroid conditions, quite frequently as well. That the gut seems to be this sort of invisible mediator, yes, between a whole constellation of autoimmune conditions that we don't yet have the etiology for, but that might trace back to the gut through this gluten-induced dysfunction, at least in some, maybe even a majority potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so I would just clarify that it's not necessarily celiac disease, but it is gluten related autoimmune, gluten as in a trigger for other autoimmune conditions. Rheumatoid arthritis is an example of that. There are even non-sort of classically categorized autoimmune conditions, but other neurological conditions, right? Like ataxia is a big one. So even conditions that don't have diagnoses, like brain fog, remove gluten and people do better. So it's one of those things where it's kind of a spectrum. I think some people are kind of gluten intolerant, right? And irritable bowel is a really common digestive syndrome that some people, they eliminate gluten, they feel better. And again, it's a little bit more complicated than that because oftentimes some deeper healing needs to happen. You can't just eliminate gluten and voila, you're healed. So for some people, that's the beginning and of a longer journey to heal whatever symptom, whatever condition that they have. But yeah, it's been really well described. Related to a whole host of conditions. And so going back to what you said about the gut, right, we know there's a Venn diagram of 3 circles, right, for autoimmune diseases to become triggered or to begin. So you have the genetic predisposition in one circle, you have environmental factors in the other, and that can be anything from infections to pollutants to I guess you can put stress in there.
Micronutrient deficiencies, perhaps.
Yeah, and to allergens to foods, right? And then in the third circle is immune dysfunction. So, and then the immune dysfunction is basically immune dysfunction / gut health, right? Is in that third circle. And so this convergence is where somewhere in there is where autoimmune conditions begin.
And where does immune dysfunction, I mean, why are so many of us walking around with immune dysfunction? Like you'd think after, the millions of years that we've been evolving, we've been anatomically modern for 200,000 years, right? But the early humans first emerged on Earth 2 million years ago, well before antiseptic mouthwash, antibacterial hand soaps. So our immune systems have had lots of time to adapt. Why now? Why are so many of us seeing such dysfunction in our immune systems?
The evolutionary biologists call any kind of chronic disease, right, or chronic condition, mismatch diseases. And so it's we've been around for a long time. We've had a long time to evolve. I mean, modernity is changing so much faster than we can sort of adapt. So I would say that there's a lot of mismatch between what our genes have evolved with and what our environment is, right? So you have this mismatch, and then you get what's called stress, right? So physiologically, we experience it as stress because there's a mismatch, and any kind of stress is going to wreak havoc on, or I don't want to say wreak havoc, but put tremendous stress on the immune system. So, thrown in there is, the modern lifestyle is, it's, our bodies, we got to move, we're adapted to move. And we are, the labels of good and bad even tossed aside, like foods. We've evolved with a certain kind of, diet. I mean, people can argue about, the compositions of those diets, but whole foods, let's just say whole foods. And, so it's not even necessarily from an evolutionary standpoint, like a bad junk foods are bad, is that we haven't evolved with them. And so it's a mismatch. And so it creates stress in our bodies, physical stress in our bodies. And then, so thrown on top of that, our immune system, our bodies will need a lot more nutrients, right, to stay in balance. And so you mentioned nutrient deficiency. If we're deficient, then, the immune system needs certain key nutrients and minerals. And then stress, big one.
Stress is a big one. Are you a fan of the hygiene hypothesis?
So, I am. I mean, it makes sense to me, I mean, I know that, certain theories today, later on are going to be debunked, but it makes some sense to me that the more it makes sense to me also just from the fact that we know one of the qualities of resilience, one of the qualities that builds resilience is diversity, right? So whether when you're an organization and people have diverse roles, right? If one person leaves the organization, everyone they can adapt and fill that in. So same thing with the ecosystem. And so I look at our gut. Yeah, you know what? As we're forming, if we're really exposed to a lot of different, different microbes, different foods, different circumstances, you know what? We can really build from that. So it makes sense to me. Yeah. But in terms of like the science and, that's it's always going to be areas like that are ripe for challenge, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, the science is always evolving, certainly. Yeah. You mentioned that you had been on sort of a more vegetarian leaning diet. And when you changed your diet, you brought back in bone broths, animal products, and things like that. And that was partly, due to your experience with the acupuncturist, and then also your discovery of, a more ancestral dietary pattern. Talk to me about that, about like some of the other dietary shifts that you made and how you see those as having helped alleviate your symptoms.
I would say those are the main ones. I did do more, I guess, stricter paleo diets, where I just eliminated all grains, I did that for a little while, and I could just tell. I could tell that, you know what, this isn't the right thing for me. Even though most of the experts and the materials I was reading was really saying, oh God, you know, for autoimmunity, not only paleo, but like autoimmune paleo. And so, again, I think for a lot of patients, and what I encourage for my own patients too is, okay, this is my set of recommendations, but I want you to listen to your body, right? And to be able to discern over time what is kind of a detox reaction, right? And what is, wait a minute, this is not working for me. And oftentimes it just takes some time to be able to tell. For me, I began to lose a lot of weight on paleo, even though I was trying to increase the starchy vegetables. And I could just feel, you know, my chi, my energy was diminishing. And another part for me was that because I was kind of a perfectionist about everything, if I did a really rigid diet, I would become perfectionistic about that. And that generated stress for me. So much of this is just learning this balance between what is optimal for healing and how to keep the mind relaxed. So I would say the vast majority of, you know, I'm still gluten and dairy free, still, you know, nutrient dense whole foods. But, you know, periodically I can do some gluten, I can do some dairy, but I choose not to. If I, you know, but I'm not so sensitive anymore where, you know, I even am concerned about cross contamination and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's really, my whole relationship to food has expanded, but it's relaxed. Whereas in the beginning, I was very like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it 100%, and I'm going to, by God, I'm going to get better. But again, balancing that out with mental stress was a big part of my journey too. So one of the areas that the pitfalls that I ran into, and this is something that I counsel all my patients on too, is not to become too limited in the amounts of the kinds of foods that we eat. You know, speaking to diversity, particularly people who are on, you know, keto diets or autoimmune paleo diets, or, you know, whatever kind of diet they're on, is oftentimes we find the foods that we like and we just kind of stick to that because then we don't have to think about it anymore. But it's really about expanding diversity. So I don't remember, I was at some functional medicine conference where a nutritionist was speaking, and she said, you know, go to the supermarket and pick out a vegetable or fruit that you haven't had in the last month, or try something new, for crying out loud, you know? And so that's where I think the pleasure and the play can come in. And it's so important for anybody on a healing journey to not toss that aside. At the heart of healing is actually just learning how to live our lives. It's not, you know, this hard-lined regimen that we have to follow. It's not boot camp, but so often it feels like that. So can we bring in pleasure? Can we bring in, you know, kind of daring oneself to try a new food, or even try something that we didn't like before? So it becomes, you know, more playful, and there's a little element of, just mystery to it. So I'm all about kind of being creative with food. And I think I'm saying that because I'm actually a little bit in a food funk right now. You know, where I'm like, I don't know what to make for dinner anymore. I'm kind of tired. I don't feel very inspired.
Man, maybe you just need a new cookbook or something.
Exactly. Well, I love flipping through cookbooks. It's one of my favorite pastimes. And I get very easily inspired. So part of it is just, I have my girls are now teenagers, and it's like, okay, what am I going to make that they're going to eat? But yeah, I just think that that's such an important element. We can get very, very prescriptive with our foods. And it's really just about connecting to our food as nourishment.
Couldn't agree more.
Couldn't do that.
Remind me, I'm gonna have to send you a copy of my new cookbook. It's called Genius Kitchen.
Oh, I love that.
And the whole book is gluten and dairy free. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
You'll love it. I love that. I mean, diversity is so crucially important. I mean, it's like a stock portfolio, right? I mean, the more diversified you are with your investments, the more future proof your portfolio is going to be. And similarly, the more diversified your diet is, there's a resilience that I think diversity builds, both in terms of your immune system, in terms of your tolerances to various foods. So I think that's really great advice.
Yeah.
Would you say that you're still managing these conditions, or would you describe yourself as being in remission from them, or like what is the current state of your?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know how to I don't know what those definitions mean anymore, in terms of remission, or the difference between cure and healed 100%. Like, I don't know, because now how I experience life and health and just the body is that everything is a continuum. So, I mean, so I mentioned, that I had this second health crisis. That was about 4 years ago. And it was almost 10 years from the first one in Beijing. And I went really deep into my qigong practice. I mean, it was kind of the only thing I could do, right? So the first time, I would say that was a whole journey about opening my mind, right? Just get out of that paradigm I was locked in, expand your truth, expand what you're seeing. And the second time, though, I was at the forefront of intuitive medicine, functional medicine, internal medicine, all of it. And I had this experience. And so the second time was really more an awakening of the spirit, or maybe we might call it going deeper into the energetics of what's happening. And so I didn't really have, many places to go except deeper into my qigong practice. And then, and I was continuing doing, I was taking herbs at this point to address tick-borne infections. I changed my diet. I was seeing my acupuncturist. I was still doing things to support my healing, but the real shift was just connecting to this realm of subtler energy. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I kind of went through this radical remission where instead of 10 years, it was months, right? It was about 6 months or so where I was just, not only was I back to where I was, but I had so much more freedom inside my body. I didn't realize how I had still been managing everything, like kind of hyper managing everything, and including my food, but literally including all of my movements, right? Like everything was very calculated. How much am I going to exercise today? Can I walk that? And at what pace? And suddenly I was like, oh my God, I have an ease in my body I hadn't had since I had developed thyroiditis. So, and I still feel that, I still have this ease, and traveling is so much easier now. I eat out at restaurants, I feel much more at ease in the world. And then I realized, it's because I feel much more at ease in my body, right? So this notion of home, micro home, and then macro home, they're really one and the same. They mirror each other. So in that sense, it's like, oh, okay, I had this radical healing. And so it's funny because people ask me, and I had thought that too. It's like, oh, I'm here. I did it. But life continues, and my body is an ecosystem that continues to change. And then life continues to change. The pandemic hit, and all this climate change and wildfires and whatnot. So it is ever evolving. Have I had challenges with my health? Yes, I have. When there have been significant stressors, okay, but do I know how to respond? I do. Do I know how to respond with a lot more compassion and less reactivity, less fear? Do I know intuitively now what foods, I need to eat to nourish me. I mean, there are still times I'm really, really perplexed. And then I say, I have more work to do, I have more inner work to do. I have more to learn. And, but I know who I am. And so it's a very different place than when I began this journey. So but to answer your question, I mean, I think these are the things that people want to know. My thyroid condition, I developed postpartum thyroiditis after the second pregnancy again, and this time it did not resolve. So I had been on levothyroxine or Synthroid for, I can't remember now how many years, probably 10 years, something like that. But as my body began to heal, I began to taper down, my dose very slowly. So I've been completely off of that medication for probably about 3-4 years now. Actually, since before the second crisis. And so am I in remission from the thyroid condition? I would say yes, by medical standards. And I don't need that medication anymore. Am I aware, and do I take herbs, or sometimes I feel like I need some iodine? Am I aware that my thyroid may be very vulnerable if I'm to have a lot of stress? I am. So these are, it's just part of being alive on this planet at this time. I would love to say I'm done. Like I'm here and I'm here to stay. And that's what I hope. But I live a very, very full life, and my qigong practice is now really, really foundational. So at least an hour a day is my practice, and it feels like eating. If I don't do it, it feels like I'm missing something. So something very, very essential. And I would say that helps keep me here, right, in this state of balance and flow, in a way that, I think would take a lot of my own effort and a lot of my own energy if I didn't have this practice.
Wow. What are some other ways that you support thyroid health? You mentioned iodine. Mm-hmm. Why iodine? Are there any other nutrients that you consider regularly when it comes to supporting thyroid function?
So thyroid function, there are different causes for the thyroid hormones being low, right? So with the autoimmune thyroid condition, my thyroid was not producing enough, right? So I was taking exogenous, the levothyroxine is that hormone replacement. And, there are more natural, right, forms of that as well. And then there are chronic inflammation can suppress the active form of the thyroid to becoming active. So stress is a huge one. Selenium is a key nutrient that helps that conversion, helps to activate the hormone. So that is another thing that just periodically it will take. Supporting the thyroid, of course, means supporting the immune system. So zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D3. I'm a huge fan of, let me just turn this in. Huge fan of, active B vitamins, folate, for people who may need it, active B12. B5 is is a B vitamin that is very important for the adrenal gland. So again, the thyroid gland is not in isolation, right? It's really part of this whole, not just the whole body, but really an integral part of the hormone axis. So oftentimes before the thyroid goes out of balance, the adrenals are already a little bit really imbalanced. So B5 helps nourish that. The heavier foods that my acupuncturist had recommended really nourishes the kidneys, right? eggs, for people who are eating eggs can really nourish that. Organ meats. So, whenever I can, I prefer to just do it with whole foods. A lemon juice cleanse is super, super easy. It's just first thing in the morning, the juice of a full lemon with water. And you don't really have to change anything during the day, but just do that first thing in the morning. Wait about 30 minutes before you eat or drink anything. And it can really help, like if my gut feels a little bit off, it somehow rebalances the gut flora. I imagine that's what it's doing anyways. It cleanses and it fortifies, and also provides a lot of antioxidants. So I don't think the science is there yet on it, but it's been in practice for a long, long time.
Well, it probably to some degree changes the pH of the stomach, right? Like you're drinking it on an empty stomach. I think coffee does that as well. And that's one of the reasons why coffee helps get people going, so to speak, in the morning. Interesting.
I had not heard that about coffee yet.
It's why decaf can actually, certain decafs can have a laxative effect. People know that coffee, yes. Because you're removing the caffeine, but still some of those acids remain, especially when you get Swiss water process decaffeinated coffee. Mm-hmm. I forget the specific compounds. It's like chlorogenic acid or caffeic acid, one of those two, but that there are these acids in coffee that stimulate the stomach. It's not just about the caffeine. So I don't know. My hypothesis would be that there's some that has some overlap with, how the lemon is working. I don't know.
Yeah. So it's just, there are always times when I feel out of balance, it's like, oh, it's not, I used to be like, oh God, my body's like, it's what do I have to do now? And now it's like, oh, this is a signal. I need to pause. I need to slow down. I need to eliminate whatever's not necessary. And I need to focus, recenter, re-nourish. Because it's easy for me to go too fast, too much.
Of course, and you're a practicing physician, which I know is a very stressful job to have.
Yeah. So and even my medical practice, I'm blessed to be in private practice, so I can design it to how it feels most resonant for me. What can I offer to my patients that feels in the flow to me right now? And if I can operate from that vantage point, then the healing is in the patient encounter, beyond what prescriptions I'm going to recommend for them.
I love that. What you mentioned, the drinking lemon in the morning. What can you just, maybe briefly, high level, walk me through like a day of eating? Like what is your sort of personal? We're not making a one size fits all suggestion here, but what is your personal anti-autoimmune protocol look like on a 24-hour period?
I have to change that question a little bit, because I don't think about it in terms of anti-autoimmune anymore. I just think of it in terms of living my life and connecting to my food, right? So how can I give myself, what nourishes me? So, like this morning, I'll just walk you through today. We haven't had dinner yet, but this morning I had a bowl of steel cut oats, soaked overnight, cooked in coconut milk, a little dollop of maple syrup, grade B, and I took my vitamins, which again, that's another thing too. Aside from coming off of the Thyroid, is at one point I was taking probably like 20 different supplements and stuff, and it was really overwhelming. And this morning I took about 3, and again, kind of using part intuition, part just knowledge. Okay, what do I need today? And again, the B complex is it's just always there because life is always a little bit, demanding. But then between breakfast and lunch, I had a nut bar. And then for lunch, what did I have for lunch? Lunch, I had, I had leftovers from last night. It was a chili my husband made. Chili. And I had an arugula salad on the side. And then I had a slice of gluten-free toast to dip into my chili. And then I always carry this, and I always have some kind of. My favorite is rooibos, is red tea. So if I'm going to be scientific about it, clinical about it, it's got all those antioxidants. It's got properties similar to green tea, but without the caffeine. Yeah. But really, I just drink it because I love it, and I feel good when I drink it. So staying hydrated is just a really easy way to just keep me in touch with my body, literally feeling more in flow, literally, right? Just drinking and then urinating, feeling more in flow, feeling like, okay, you know what? I'm just doing what feels really refreshing.
I love that. Are you, do you abstain from caffeine?
I do. I was a coffee lover. I love the taste of it, but I don't do well with caffeine. So I don't miss it anymore. There was a long period where I missed it. Even when I wrote a lot about grief, grief and releasing grief and transforming grief in my memoir. And that was an important part of my healing journey as well. And actually, funnily, there were really extreme, griefs that I was carrying around. Like, I had my partner when I was in medical school was killed in a car accident, like big grief, right? But I actually grieved things like giving up coffee, because those things mattered to me, and they were something that I deeply enjoyed. And so, but I don't really miss it anymore. I don't really grieve it anymore.
Aw. You're so sweet. I love coffee too, and I do caffeine very sparingly. A lot of the time, I'll just do decaf, and then once or twice a week, I'll throw a little bit of caffeinated beans into my brew for the. Usually, when you're not dependent on caffeine, coffee gives you that a sense of euphoria that you don't get when you're dependent on it. When you're dependent on it, you're just treating your withdrawal with every cup.
That's an interesting, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. So
I give gratitude for people who can have coffee or caffeine, even in the form of black or green tea. So I think I'm just, I haven't tested my genotype or anything, but I probably have the polymorphism where I'm a slow metabolizer of caffeine. So I get very activated by it. And I would say when you're going back to your question about remission and, where are you and stuff. And, one of my earliest symptoms was challenges sleeping. And so that's one of the first areas that I can see then, I'm a little bit out of balance. And so, if I'm, if that's still, one of the areas that, pokes its head up, and I'm really not going to do caffeine.
Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one.
I think it's really hard to give a blanket statement of what people should eat, because I do think it is quite personalized, but I think there's some principles that we can all use that can be helpful, which is really focusing on whole foods. Focus on clean foods that came from the earth, that are minimally processed, that are not covered in, pesticides, and that hopefully come from good soil and are filled with nutrients.
Casey Means, how's it going?
Great. How are you, Max?
Thanks for coming out to LA.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
What brings you to town?
I was here for the Recode conference at the Beverly Hilton. So speaking about the future of biowearables, biosensors, and glucose monitoring and metabolic health with Kara Swisher. It was a lot of fun.
I hear you know a thing or two about these topics.
I love these topics. I could talk about them all day.
So talk to me, to share your background with me and my audience, if you can. Let's start
Sure.
there.
Absolutely. So I'm a medical doctor by training, and I actually trained as a head and neck surgeon. So I did my undergrad in medical school at Stanford and then went up to Oregon to do surgical training. And in ENT, head and neck surgery, I'm treating all of these conditions that are essentially disorders of inflammation. It was like all day long, sinusitis, thyroiditis, laryngitis, all these itises. And itis is the suffix in medicine that means inflammation.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so, I'm throwing steroid prescriptions at everyone. Steroids, tamp down the immune system. And, you also do antibiotics all the time. And then when those things don't work, you take them to the operating room, you bust a hole in their sinus or their ear or whatever, and you suck out pus and you send them on their way. And after a while, I sort of really started stepping back and saying, where is all this inflammation coming from? Like, why don't we talk about what the root cause of this is? Like, inflammation is a sign from the body that there's a threat and that something's going on. What is that threat? And I'd been fortunate to have a bit of a background in functional medicine. I'd been reading, Mark Hyman since I was young and kind of had a sense of some of these things. And that, really in our modern world, a lot of the triggers of inflammation are our diet and lifestyle, as you well know. And a big driver of them is metabolic dysfunction. And so kind of started putting some of these pieces together and looking at some of the physiology of these conditions I was treating day in and day out. And realizing like you can't actually operate on the immune system. Like it doesn't make sense. Like you may operate on the downstream symptoms of a condition, but you're not actually sending that patient away with optimized cellular biology. You're not actually fixing the root cause of the problem. And when you look at some of the top killers in the United States, which are like heart disease, cancer, stroke, Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, all of these we also know have a lot of inflammation going on with them. And when you sort of create this Venn diagram of like the cytokines or immune mediators that are sort of upregulated in these conditions, the one for all the ENT conditions are kind of the same for all the ones that are these chronic disorders. It's like, interleukin 6 and TNF alpha. And not to get too wonky, but it's like there's clearly something going on that's related to all of these things. Why don't we treat at that level in medicine? Well, because we're in a reactive system that waits until diseases manifest and then we play whack-a-mole medicine where unfortunately we treat each condition as if they're totally separate, different things, as if they're isolated silos. And that feeds into the system that we have where we kind of give a different medication for every single condition. And unfortunately, the reality is this doesn't really work. Healthcare costs are going up in our country, $4 trillion now. They're going up every single year and people are getting sicker, people are getting heavier, people are getting more depressed. It's just not working. And so as a physician, I'm sitting there taking people to the operating room every day. It is a huge thing to operate on someone. Like you're cutting into their body. Like, and then they're coming back for revision surgeries and just thinking I'm not really making the impact that I want on helping people be healthier. I'm certainly sucking the pus out, but I'm not actually making these bodies healthier or doing anything to actually impact the rest of their overall holistic health. So that was sort of my journey towards kind of really stepping away and looking into kind of what the root causes were. And that led me towards the path of really being pretty obsessed with metabolic disease because it's underlying so much of the pathology we're seeing in this country right now. And, metabolic disease, what that really means is that bodies have a problem processing energy in the body. They have a process using it, making it, storing it. And what this, shows up as is, obviously overt diseases of metabolism like diabetes and obesity. But I think what people might not realize is that it's actually underlying so many of the other conditions we're seeing, like we were just talking about cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, even other subtle things that aren't necessarily killers, but other pain points like erectile dysfunction, infertility, gout, depression, anxiety, et cetera. So we've got to, as doctors, figure out how to fix this and how to help people with this if we're going to actually make a big dent in the chronic disease epidemic that we have in this country. And so started thinking about levers of like, how do we do that? And one of the best ways that we can do that is help people manage their blood sugar because blood sugar is one of those key parts of our energy processing in the body. And we're just eating, way too much blood sugar. And basically the average American is having trouble processing blood sugar in this country. And that's leading to metabolic disease. Over 50% of Americans have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. It's insane. That number should be close to zero. And more broadly, a recent study in 2018 from UNC showed that 88% of Americans have at least one biomarker of metabolic dysfunction, which means impaired blood sugar, cholesterol, or weight. And so this is clearly one of those elephants in the room that like we have to solve. And as a physician, I just said like, if I'm going to be fulfilled in my career and feel like I'm really doing something meaningful, like this is the issue I have to address. This is underlying so much of the morbidity. I can certainly help people doing ENT procedures, but like I've got to focus my energy on something that really is going to, I think, have a bigger impact. And so that led me towards ultimately creating a functional medicine private practice, moving away from ENT, and then thinking about how to really scale solutions. And so that led me to starting Levels, which is the company that I co-founded and chief medical officer of, which is a company that gives people access to biosensors, continuous glucose monitors. They can actually track their glucose 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and see exactly how food is affecting their body in real time and get a real sense of what their blood sugar is so that they can hopefully know what's going on with their metabolic health, track it over time, figure out how to optimize it, and just stay out of this whole mess of metabolic disease that's just completely plaguing our country.
I love that. I don't want to talk about metabolic health, but let's take a step back before we do that. And can you just define metabolism for the audience? Because I feel like that's a term that people hear a lot these days, along with inflammation. But you're a physician, so what actually, when you say metabolism, what does that mean?
Yeah. So simply put, metabolism is all the chemical and cellular reactions that are happening in the body that produce energy from food. It's how we transform the food that we eat into energy that we can use. And then if we're not using that energy, how we store it. And this is fundamental to all aspects of health, because if you think about it, all we are really is 37 trillion cells. Like that's our entire structure. We, of course, have trillions of bacterial cells as well. But every single one of those 37 trillion cells in our bodies need energy to function properly. And when cells don't function properly because they're not making the energy they need, depending on which cell type that's happening in, it could look like totally different symptoms. If that's happening in the brain, it could look like dementia, chronic pain, depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, Alzheimer's, dementia, all conditions associated with poor metabolism. If it's happening in the ovary, it could look like polycystic ovarian syndrome, leading cause of infertility in the US, a metabolic condition. If it's happening in the penis, it could look like erectile dysfunction, which is also a metabolic disease. Metabolic dysfunction causes the blood vessels to narrow, causing problems like that. If it's in the heart, it could look like stroke, et cetera, et cetera. We could literally go through any organ system. And if there's a metabolic problem, meaning the way that a problem with how energy is produced, you can see symptoms showing up. We tend to look at those all as disparate things when in fact, for many of them, one of the key contributing factors is this just core pathway of producing energy being screwed up. And really the reason it's screwed up is because the way we're living in the modern Western world is hijacking our cellular physiology, our core basic pathways of how to produce energy. And the reason that's happening is because one of the factors is food, certainly. And sugar is a big one. We're eating, probably almost like 20 times more sugar than we were eating 100 years ago. The average American, you'll see different statistics, but eating somewhere around 60 to 152 pounds of sugar per year. We should probably be eating less than like 1 pound of sugar per year. So that just like monumental load on the body gums up the system. And then of course, like industrialized seed and vegetable oils, which you talk about a lot, these things cause oxidative stress, which hurts our mitochondria, which are the energy factories of the cell, also create metabolic dysfunction. And then lots of other things in our industrialized food is causing this issue. But then it's other things like it's stress, it's sleep deprivation, high cortisol, it's lack of physical activity, it's micronutrient deficiencies, it's microbiome perturbations, it's exposure to environmental toxins. These all cripple our cellular biology and the way that our cells make energy. And so we're unfortunately facing a situation where we have just this like energy problem in the vast majority of bodies in the United States, and it's showing up as dozens of symptoms because when cells can't make energy, they're dysfunctional. When cells are dysfunctional, tissues are dysfunctional. When tissues are dysfunctional, organs are dysfunctional, and that's what symptoms and disease is. We really have to start looking at it in that way. And so that's really simply what metabolism is. It's how we produce energy, and it's fundamental to every single cell in the body, and we want it to work properly.
And I think it's so great that you guys are setting out to tackle this from the standpoint of diet and nutrition, because that's definitely one of the more impactful factors. Of course, you mentioned our activity levels, sleep plays a role, the microbiome. It's almost in a way like I would describe it as energy toxicity. We're just like we're eating too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And the energy toxicity thing is really interesting because we have too much sort of energy in terms of calories coming into the body, but we're not using it properly. because we're disrupting our mitochondria's ability to process it. And so a lot of it's being stored. And that's why you're seeing so much in the way of the overweight and obesity epidemic, with 74% of Americans dealing with overweight or obesity. It's astronomical. And this is downstream of this cellular problem that we have so much power to improve, and we can improve it rapidly in our own lives. But it does take, awareness to this and really being vigilant. Like, if you're an American today, more likely than not, you're going to be chronically ill by the time you're an adult. That's really sad. And also, if you just go on the normal treadmill of just like American culture, you will get sick. That's almost a guarantee. If you just do whatever is the norms, sitting, eating packaged foods, which make up 70% of our calories these days, kind of letting your phone beep in the middle of the night so you're getting poor sleep, like, you're going to get sick. And so you really have to do something differently these days if you want to escape that. And the beauty is, like, it's fairly simple. And it's, but you do have to be vigilant and you have to be aware. And that's where I think education, like what you and many others are doing in the nutrition space and the wellness space, but also potentially things like monitors, which is really why I'm excited about Levels, is that it gives people the data in their own hands. And so you get to move past these systems that I think in many ways are kind of manipulating people, like the food industry, which is literally designing food to take you to your bliss point. Like, it's designed to make you just feel like you're desperate for it, to like induce leptin resistance so that you're actually hungrier, like to cause these blood sugar spikes and crashes, which actually make you crave more. Like, we know how the brain works. Like, these foods make us dependent on them. And so to have some data that serves as agency and some recourse in the face of monumental challenges we're facing today to be healthy is really cool. Because, like, an example is, and this isn't even like necessarily like a junk food, but I was eating oatmeal frequently for breakfast because, of course, doctors tell you that you should eat oatmeal to be healthy and for your cholesterol. And the box literally says heart healthy on it.
Yeah.
Like, this is a great source of whole grains. So I eat, one little package of instant oats. And was actually for this particular experiment, I ate 2 packages of instant oats with nothing on them, no sugar, no berries, no nothing. Blood sugar went up 80 points. I never want my blood sugar to go 80 points. I usually, after a meal, I want it to go up maybe 20 or 30 glucose points, but usually not above 110 milligrams per deciliter. I went up to about 170. So we know that big glucose spikes like that, which is called glycemic variability, that directly is actually an independent predictor of future risk of diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and stroke. Your body does not like these big blood sugar spikes, no matter what people tell you about, like, oh, well, in a normal, healthy person, these don't matter. That's not true. Glycemic variability is an independent predictor of future, downstream problems. So for me, in my body, in one breakfast, I can say, this is not heart healthy. This is not something I should be eating if I want long-term cardiovascular health. And this is just not a good food for me, at least in that permutation. Certainly there's ways to kind of hack oatmeal. You can eat steel cut oats or groats and add fat, fiber, and protein and blah, blah, blah. But like, that is not heart healthy. So through that, I have agency. I've cut through food marketing. I've had agency in the face of a healthcare system that is giving me really generic advice, unfortunately, because doctors are not trained in nutrition. And, I think the average doctor has really good intentions, but the reality is that the healthcare system profits off people who are sick. And that's kind of built into the system. And we get paid to, take care of sick people. And so none of it's aligned or incentivized with my optimal thriving and health. And by having the data myself, I'm able to make small micro decisions like that are actually allowing me to make choices that are right for my body.
Yeah, so true. What are the potential harms, though, that can come from a transient and acute blood sugar, quote unquote, spike? I mean, if you're eating a banana or a I don't know, what's something that I eat that has, or a piece of like gluten-free sourdough bread. And maybe you've had a workout like earlier in the day and you have a transient excursion in your blood glucose levels. What are the risks to come from that?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that the body is extremely resilient. And so one-time things, I'm not too worried about. And no one should freak out over a single glucose spike. This is really, we're talking about trends over time.
Got it.
And the body being affected over time. However, there are things that can happen acutely. And there's 4 main things about a glucose spike that I think are well established in the literature that are worth being aware of. So a glucose spike, a high one, is going to cause a few downstream things. One is it can cause glycation of things in the body. Glycation is sugar sticking to things like fat, protein, DNA, whatever, and proteins. And that sugar sticking to molecules, which sometimes is called like rusting of the body, leads to dysfunction in those things. So you don't want glycation. And when blood sugar is high, it's going to stick to more stuff. The second is oxidative stress. So the generation of free radicals in the body, these reactive molecules that can cause damage to parts of the cell. And the third is inflammation. A lot of blood sugar in the body, in the bloodstream, really quickly says to the body that something's different, something's off, something's a little weird, and that can generate some acute inflammation. And the fourth, which is the one that will like affect you and that you can kind of notice, is reactive hypoglycemia. So basically, when you have, you eat a bunch of carbohydrates, it's going to be transformed into your bloodstream into glucose. Your body's then going to release insulin from the pancreas, as you know, which will let you take that glucose into your cells for use or for storage. But when the glucose spike is high, your body really will send out a big insulin surge. And sometimes it can overshoot and basically suck up tons of glucose really quickly into your cells and lead to a dip, actually lower glucose levels than before your meal. And that little phase is called reactive hypoglycemia. And often that can be associated with anxiety, mood lability, fatigue, maybe some brain fog, and cravings for sure. And so a lot of what I'm thinking about when I'm eating is how do I avoid reactive hypoglycemia? And how you can avoid it is by keeping things much more like gentle rolling hills in your glucose, never having that huge insulin surge. You're just kind of like staying around a safe sort of median level during the day. I think glucose variability like often translates into variability in my actual day subjectively, whether it's mood, energy, athletic performance, brain sharpness. And so for me, one of the best life hacks of my life has been just figuring out how to keep glucose more stable so that my days feel just more stable. So those are the four kind of acute things. The bigger picture thing that you want to think about with those glucose spikes is how it's actually ultimately leading you down the spectrum of metabolic disease. Because as I said, one glucose spike isn't going to do it. But if you're doing that 5 times a day, day after day, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, that is causing problems that are going to lead you down that road of metabolic disease. And the way that happens is that those repeated insulin spikes from the glucose, the cells are having to respond to all that insulin. And ultimately, they're going to say, this is too much. We can't force more glucose into these cells. And the cells become numb to insulin, which is called insulin resistance. And they actually block that signal. And the body responds by producing more insulin to overcompensate. So now you've got insulin levels going up in the body to try and sort of force more glucose in. And this is essentially, this insulin resistance is the process towards type 2 diabetes and all the other associated conditions. For people who are worried about weight or trying to lose weight, this is directly related to that because that insulin, that hormone has many, many effects. One is to get the glucose into the cells, but it's also a signal to the body to not burn fat. Because what it's saying to the body is we have tons of glucose around for energy, and our two main energy sources in the body are glucose and fat. And so when that insulin's high, it's saying, we don't need to burn fat. We've got tons of glucose, stop burning fat. And so for anyone who's on a weight loss journey, those repeated glucose spikes are just directly working against you, essentially. So those are the main reasons why we want to keep it more flat and stable.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we definitely consume too many carbohydrates. I think the average American today consumes about, 300 grams of carbs a day? And clearly, like the best way to reduce the glucose like area under the curve in our bodies is to just eat less of it. But my concern then is like, how do we, get this message out there without pathologizing like healthy sources of carbohydrates, right? Like the big bowl of berries, which we know are great for our brains, or I don't know, what are some great, sweet potatoes, things like that. I mean, these are not dangerous foods, right? So my question to you is then, like, for somebody who's wearing a continuous glucose monitor who then goes and eats like a bowl of berries or a sweet potato and they see their blood sugar spike, like, how do we like allay their fears and let them know that this is actually like, okay to eat? I don't even want to use the language once in a while. I mean, you can have a sweet potato every day if you want, right? Like that's not going to be, you've got bigger fish to fry if that's what you're concerned about.
Totally. It's a great point. And I think the answer is it's about nuanced education. And that's why with Levels, like we're a small company still, but like a good portion of our team is all our education team and our content team, because honestly, it is complex to kind of work through these things. And And I think you mentioned the bigger fish to fry. I think big picture, one of the bigger fish to fry with having access to these monitors is for the person who's not necessarily making these micro optimizations. Like, should I eat raspberries or blackberries? But
That's
like,
me.
right. It's the people who are drinking 2 cans of soda a day and who are eating really sweet breakfast because they actually think that that's okay. Like that cereal is, an okay thing to eat for breakfast, which it's not. Or it's fine to eat, but it's not going to align with optimal health.
It's not optimal. Yeah.
Everything's okay depending on what your goals are. But, and so it's those are the things where it's just like, oh my God, I actually thought this was okay. Or like, but it's being able to see the data. It's just amazing how seeing the data, feeling what you're feeling in your body. So the subjective response, like, I don't feel great. I feel tired, seeing that aligned with a spike, and then knowing what you ate, that sort of trifecta of like choice, data, and subjective feeling, I think is really the essence of behavior change. And so that's really like for the larger population and the bigger sort of population in the US, who's eating a lot of ultra processed foods. Like that's what I think this is going to bring to their lives. Now, to actually answer your question though, with berries and sweet potatoes, so I'm of the camp that like if it's a whole food that's unrefined, it's a good thing for your body. Like our body knows how to deal with whole foods, and if we're primarily eating those, we're going to do well. Now there are ways to even eat certain whole foods in a way that is actually, I think, more optimal for the body. So for instance, if you're eating the berries, you can find many ways to mitigate a glucose spike by eating the berries with additional fiber, fat, or protein to not have such a glycemic excursion. And I actually think that is probably better for the body. So what that might look like is some whole milk yogurt, or, full fat, cashew, non-dairy, unsweetened yogurt with some chia seeds and flax seeds on top and the berries. And so that might actually, let's say we're going to have a 50-point glucose spike with a pint of blueberries, it might be a 10-point glucose spike if you have it with some of these other foods, especially the fiber. I've noticed that to be one of the biggest things. So I'm now adding like chia seeds and flax to almost everything. And with the sweet potatoes as well, I had a cup of sweet potatoes. I've done a lot of experiments with the continuous glucose monitor on, and actually sweet potatoes caused a huge spike for me, like probably around 60 or 70 points. It was just 1 cup of baked sweet potato. Like that was it, nothing on it. And that's a lot. I actually don't want, I would not probably eat them by themselves because it is causing a large glycemic excursion. But when I eat sweet potatoes a few things. If I eat sweet potatoes with, again, like fiber on them, so like adding a bunch of other vegetables, maybe adding like a sort of whole food fat dressing, like a tahini or, something like that.
Yum.
And take a walk afterwards for 20 minutes. Or, we know with resistant starches, if you take the sweet potato, cool it in the fridge, and then reheat it, it'll actually likely cause less of a glucose response, because when you cool the sweet potato, it changes the carbohydrate structure so that it creates resistant starch and is less digestible. You could also eat protein and vegetables before you eat the sweet potato, which we know that if you eat protein or like roughage, they've studied like if you have a salad before a high carb meal, it actually has less of a glucose response. So like salad, chicken, or whatever before the sweet potato, maybe gonna have a lower glucose response. So there's like a dozen things you can do around the sweet potato to actually get all the beautiful nutrients that has, the beta carotenes and all that stuff, and have less of a glycemic excursion. And so that's getting really like nuanced and nitty gritty, but I think it's a cool way to kind of design your meal such that you're getting all the beautiful stuff from the food, but with less of the collateral damage.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, if I wonder what would be, because like if I'm about to eat a bowl of berries, which have a certain sort of like caloric value, like would I then want to add like a tablespoon of fat or whatever to the berries and then just be adding like, empty calories from fat?
Well, it depends on how you respond to it. So like the really interesting thing about glucose is that everyone responds differently to the same food. So you and I could eat the exact same bowl of berries and have totally different responses. And this has been studied in some really interesting research over the past 5 years. there was this great study from the journal Cell from 5 years ago called Personalized Nutrition by Prediction of Glycemic Responses.
Was that the microbiome study?
It was microbiome, plus they found 137 factors. Like that was the big headline, was the microbiome, but they, in their algorithm, they actually put in like over 100 things that were related to why people responded differently. But the take home from the paper was that you can give 800 non-diabetic, quote unquote, like healthy people the same standardized meals, and what we would expect based on what we thought, which is that each food has an inherent property to raise glucose, that everyone respond exactly the same. And that's kind of how the glycemic index chart works, is like, oh, if you eat a piece of white bread, it has this glycemic index, so it's going to raise your blood sugar this much. And they found the opposite. They found that people reacted completely across a huge spectrum to the same food. So people were eating the exact same standardized cookie, and some people would go up none, and some people would go up 80 points. And it was just absolutely fascinating. And one of the big factors that they saw as predictive of how they would respond was microbiome composition. So that's one thing with the berries. Like maybe you don't spike to berries, which is great. But I know that I actually do spike to several of the like low glycemic berries, like a pint of blueberries or something. So for me, it may be that I add them to like the fatty, like the yogurt, and add some fiber. It might just be that I decide to not do that because I don't want more empty calories, like you said, and I just take a 15-minute walk afterwards, which has a massive impact on how you respond to it. Or maybe I do them right after my high intensity interval training workout when my muscles are like super primed to be insulin sensitive and to take up glucose. So there's like all these different ways to approach it. But I do think overall, the more we can keep our glucose flat and stable, the better for long-term health. That doesn't necessarily mean we always have to add, fat and protein to every carb we eat, but there's other adjuncts like the walking and exercising, making sure we're eating our higher carb meals after a good night's sleep and not when we're sleep deprived, because our glucose responses are always going to be higher. And our insulin responses if we eat them after a really poor night's sleep. So there's just these sort of ancillary things that you can do to think about the context with which that meal is coming into your body to minimize that metabolic response.
I think it's fascinating that you become essentially pre-diabetic on just one night of bad sleep. Because I wore the Levels CGM for 2 weeks, and I sleep pretty well. I wasn't, I don't think I recall having like a night of bad sleep during that period, but that would be fascinating to measure and see.
Yeah.
Is that what your data is showing you as well?
I mean, for me, we haven't necessarily seen it on the large scale. We haven't done that analysis yet, but for me personally, there's no question. Like it's just a frame shift up my whole day if I'm on a couple poor nights of sleep or if I'm traveling, especially. And we just recently did a study with Whoop where we actually saw that people's recovery score and their metabolic score seem to correlate. And recovery score is largely driven by like how your sleep quality was. And so that's not surprising to me at all. But like if I'm on really poor sleep and I know my glucose is going to be basically 10 points higher like all day, I tend to do a little bit more of a keto day, and if I'm like exercising and doing Peloton and slept for 8 hours, like, sure, I'm more insulin sensitive that day. There's no question. And I can probably tolerate a little bit more carbs.
One of the most fascinating things I learned when I was wearing the Levels was that your blood sugar can spike for reasons other than what you've just consumed. I was sitting in my brother's infrared sauna. Shout out to Clearlight Saunas. And I was shocked to see that my blood sugar, actually, there was a pretty significant spike from that. And I posted that on my Instagram. And of course, I got a lot of people asking me questions like, so does that mean saunas are bad for you? But walk us through that. Like, how does that work? How would sitting in a sauna cause your blood sugar to spike?
Yeah. So there's two reasons. One, which is less fun of an answer, which is that it may have been sensor error, because heat actually really does impact the sensor quite a bit. They're pretty temperature sensitive. But it's also possible that it was your physiologic response. And that was likely stress mediated. So heat and cold are both acute stressors for the body. And the body has this really interesting hormonal response where basically under times of stress, whether it's that sort of what we would consider positive hormetic stress, like a sauna, or kind of chronic low grade, not good stress, like just like psychological, living the modern life of like emails and honking and low sleep, so any type of stress, though, releases catecholamine hormones and cortisol in the body. And this actually goes to the liver and signals to the liver to break down its stored glucose. The liver stores like a few hours worth of glucose in chains called glycogen. And it's kind of like our debit account, like our short-term savings account for energy. The long-term account being the fat stores and the short-term being the liver.
That's the savings account.
The savings account, exactly. And so those hormones tell the liver, break it down. The body's stressed. We're having something going on, and we need glucose to fuel, the muscles and the brain right now. And so it can be like a rapid response where, let's say you're giving a talk at work and you're stressed out. Like 5 minutes into it, you might start seeing your glucose go up. It's really amazing how quick it is. That may be what's happening in the sauna. We've certainly seen that with people in ice baths who we know it's not sensor error because they've actually kept their arm with the sensor on it outside of the bath and they see a spike. And then the other time we see this reaction happening is when people are doing really high intensity interval training workouts where usually they have to be above like about 80% VO2 max or roughly 80% max heart rate. That is a stressor, an acute stressor for the body. Again, probably like a hormetic kind of good stressor, adaptive stressor, but it will make your glucose go up. So if you're kind of doing a light jog or a walk, glucose will usually stay stable or go down. But once you go up to that above 80% VO2 max, it sends the stress signal to the body. And so often during like CrossFit workouts, Peloton workouts, you'll see like, you can see a 20, 30, 40, some people see like a 60-point rise in their glucose. That one, while it is stress mediated, I would not consider a bad glucose response. And the reason for that is because unlike the other stressors like psychological stress or chronic stress, with the workout, you're activating your muscles to take all that glucose up and your muscles are becoming more insulin sensitive during that workout. And something really cool about muscle as a tissue is it actually doesn't require insulin it has an insulin independent way of taking up glucose. Just the contraction itself will soak up glucose. So you're dumping this glucose from the liver, but there's a sink for it. It's taking it in. And we know that those workouts just acutely make you more insulin sensitive. So overall, a workout spike is not something to worry about. It's like a different physiologic sort of process. But the stress spikes, I think those are really good feedback because we don't want to be like, that's where you're basically releasing glucose, but there's not a sink for it. Like you're not running from a lion. You're not actually using your muscles. So that glucose is just sitting in the bloodstream and your body is going to need to generate insulin to take that up. That's not good. And especially in our stressful modern lives, if that's happening like multiple times a day, day after day, that's not a positive thing. So, so that's sort of some of the thinking behind the.
So that's fascinating. So for people that go to their doctors and they get their annual, physicals and they see that their blood sugar, either their fasting blood sugar is elevated or their A1C is higher than they would like it to be, that could be purely from stress, right? Chronic stress.
I think it's a huge contributor. Yeah. I mean, there are people who are on like perfect dialed in diets, like really low carb, whole foods, healthy fats. And if you're still chronically stressed and not really dealing with the stress well, you can see metabolic issues.
Fascinating.
So that's a key lever. Like I'd say food is, in my opinion, always going to be like the top thing on this sort of like, what are the areas we can intervene on? But sleep, stress, and movement like are both right there. And they kind of all need to be dialed in for optimal metabolic health. And if you're seeing your numbers not where you want them to be, and you feel like your diet is just like perfect, I'd really be thinking about the sleep, the stress management, and how can we fit more movement in throughout the day, and not just one big workout a day, but how can we really move throughout the day? Like, walk for 2 or 3 minutes every hour. Like it's not just about the one workout a day. The research has actually shown that the people with the best glucose levels are the ones who move consistently throughout the day. So those are just definitely ones to think about if people are plateaued.
So important. I try to get 10,000 steps a day and I fail miserably most days because I live in LA. You're always in your car. It's such a big problem. But I feel so much better on the days that I'm able to get close to that goal. Or when I'm traveling, in other cities, it's a lot easier to walk. I'm from New York City, which is where,
New York.
Yeah, I mean, New York is like the place. You could easily do like 20,000 steps in a day in New York.
Without trying.
And it's just like, just like getting to and from work or something. Talk about labs and like how physicians typically diagnose metabolic illness. Like what are some of the features that you would see, on a lab that would make you think, oh, this patient is metabolically unwell?
Yeah. So in terms of the standard lab tests that you're going to hear about when you go into the doctor's office, the 3 ways that we diagnose like frank prediabetes or diabetes in this country are fasting glucose, an oral glucose tolerance test, and hemoglobin A1C. Those are the 3 tests approved by the American Diabetes Association to tell us about where we fall on this spectrum. And with fasting glucose, if your fasting glucose is under 100, you're considered normal or non-diabetic. If you're between 100 and 125, you're considered pre-diabetic, and 125 or above 125 is considered type 2 diabetes. With the oral glucose tolerance test, it has its own ranges. And then for hemoglobin A1C, which is basically a marker of how much sugar has been sticking to your red blood cells, it's more of a marker of like a 3-month average of your blood sugars. That's done in a percentage of your hemoglobin in the red blood cells that's been glycated or have sugar stuck to it. And if you're below 5.7%, you're considered non-diabetic, 5.7 to 6.4 pre-diabetic, and about 6.5 or above type 2 diabetes. So these tests are kind of really blunt instruments in terms of understanding. And unfortunately, the problem with these tests is that they miss so much sort of pre-disease. They miss telling people that they are creeping up on the spectrum of a problem and that their cellular physiology is problematic it waits way too long. And so there was a fascinating paper in The Lancet, which is a premier medical journal from a couple of years ago, that basically showed that once your fasting glucose has gone into the range where someone would tell you have a problem, you've probably had insulin resistance for over 13 years beforehand. But unfortunately, we don't test for insulin resistance in standard medical practice. And a lot of doctors would think you're crazy if you're like, I want to test insulin levels, I want to test insulin sensitivity. There are tests to do those things. So a lot of more progressive doctors, like in the functional medicine space and the longevity space, it's like fasting insulin is one of the first tests they'll do because that is going to rise far before your fasting glucose. The reason for that is because that insulin is rising to compensate, to keep that glucose down until the system kind of gets too far out of whack and then it can't compensate anymore and the glucose starts rising. But you can imagine like the body can compensate for a long time before that happens. So the interesting thing about fasting glucose is that we bucket people into this under 100 as normal or healthy category, which is really like an unfortunate fallacy to tell people that if you are not at 100 yet, you're totally fine. What the research has actually shown is that as you move up in the normal range of fasting glucose, you have a much higher risk for downstream problems, which is not surprising, but that's not the way we approach it. If you're in that bucket, you're fine. If there's not a red flag on the chart that your doctor's seeing, I would say most of the time the doctor's going to say, yeah, everything looks good. Which is not true. If you're up at 97, 98, 99, you are far down that spectrum of insulin resistance and metabolic disease. It's not like something magical changes when you flip over 100 into like 100 and 101.
Right.
Probably things have been going on for years and there's a huge opportunity to get to right the ship, and it's very possible to just move right back into a healthy range. And so when you look at the research, it's actually probably more optimal to be between 72 and 85 for your fasting glucose, not up in the 85 to 100 range. So I'd love to see, more research showing the long-term outcomes of sort of the differences with the normal range so that we can give people more of an optimal range to shoot for, as opposed to just this bucket of, you're not in the quote unquote prediabetes phase yet. We really need to be looking at things more as like, where on the spectrum are you, not which bucket are you in? Because the body doesn't work in buckets. We are like this complex physiologic process. And, it's not like a light switch goes on and all of a sudden we have a problem tomorrow when today we were fine. The really cool thing about lab tests is that we can actually suss out where we are on the metabolic spectrum by looking at our cholesterol panel, and kind of like discerning some clues from that. If your doctor's not willing to order a fasting insulin test, you can look at your cholesterol panel and get a general sense of what's going on with your insulin sensitivity, which is cool.
Well, why wouldn't a doctor be okay with that? Is it not covered by insurance or what?
It's not covered by insurance for most people, and it's just not part of our standard guidelines for how we diagnose these things. And I think this again comes back to our really reactive medical system and, the efficiency of the medical system. We've had to do like glucose is like cheap and easy to measure from a public health standpoint. It literally takes 1 drop of blood to measure fasting glucose. It's very simple. And so it's become the standard. And we have learned, and really it is a downstream lagging indicator of a physiology problem.
Right.
We're not actually testing for the physiology problem. We're testing for the downstream result of that problem. And I think part of that is that we may not have necessarily, known sort of the physiology when we were sort of figuring out what these public health tests were going to be. And so medicine takes a long time to catch up with the research. It can take up to 20 years for something that was published in the research to make it into clinical practice. And I think we're in that awkward in between right now where we realize insulin is really the problem, but we're not testing it yet. But through conversations like this and research that's happening, I think we'll get there. The other sad thing about healthcare is that oftentimes the things we test are based on the things that we can actually treat. So we have medications to bring glucose down. We don't necessarily have medications that like directly impact insulin sensitivity. We do have some like metformin, but when we have medications that really very clearly kind of can track that marker like glucose, we tend to favor those. So but overall, if you're listening, like ask your doctor for a fasting insulin test. You want it to be low, like ideally definitely under 10. A lot of people will say under 8 or under 5 for sort of optimal insulin sensitivity. But on the cholesterol panel, some really important things to look at are the triglycerides, because triglycerides are kind of a general marker of what's happening with carbohydrate processing in our body. Typically, people will say they should be under 150. I know a lot of doctors who want them to be under 100, some say under 70. And so if triglycerides are riding above 150, like that's really something to dig into. And if you're seeing triglycerides a little high, fasting glucose a little high, that's a signal like there may be something going on. The other thing that's a really important ratio that you can calculate is triglyceride to HDL ratio. HDL is like what we'd consider our good cholesterol. And we want HDL to be high and triglycerides to be low. So we want that ratio to be quite low. Like some people say potentially like 1. So basically your triglycerides and your HDL being the same, which would be very, very hard to achieve.
Wow.
Because you can imagine then you'd have like, if your HDL was 70, which is high, and triglycerides were really low at 70, the ratio would be 1. That would be very, very hard to accomplish. Some doctors will say less than 4. So essentially 4-to-1 ratio between triglycerides and HDL. I think that's too high. Some will say that it varies by race. So I believe Robert Lustig, who wrote Metabolic, I'd have to double check this, but I think he says like 2.5 or 3.5 based on whether you're Caucasian or of African-American descent, but we can maybe link to that. But the general take-home point is that we want that triglyceride to HDL ratio to be low because that seems to be a great surrogate marker for insulin sensitivity. So that's getting kind of into the weeds, but I would just say people should focus on take the cholesterol panel you got last year that's on your, online portal. Take a look at your triglycerides, take a look at your triglyceride to HDL ratio, and, see where things are standing and maybe, bring it up with your doctor.
Yeah. What about LDL? That's a contentious topic in the online nutrition space. Some say that it doesn't matter at all. Some say that it's still the most important causal player in cardiovascular disease. What's your position?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we're learning is that probably one of the most important things with relation to LDL is the particle size of the LDLs in our body. So LDL is not just one thing. There's actually different types of particles that make up that total LDL number. And some of the important ones we talk about are small density LDL and large density LDL, with large density LDL being likely safer and less promoting of cardiovascular disease, and small density LDL, which you can think of like little pellets, are actually much more dangerous. They lodge into the blood vessel walls, they cause inflammation and the hardening of the arteries that we think about with heart disease. So we want more large density, less small density. And what's interesting is that triglyceride to HDL ratio that I was just talking about may actually be somewhat predictive of where you skew on the small density to high LDL compared to large density LDL, where if that ratio is lower, it's likely that you are favoring that large density, safer pattern of LDLs. So
also referred to as pattern A.
Pattern A and pattern B, right? So you want those fluffy, big particles, basically. And so while the LDL number, if it's really, really high, I think above like 200 or so, you want to start thinking about like what's going on for sure. But the first thing I would do is figure out what the particle size are. So that would be asking your doctor for a what's called advanced lipid testing or NMR lipid test, which will break down the LDL into the particle sizes and give you a sense of what your risk is. But what we know is that a low sugar diet and a low carbohydrate diet will bring that small density LDL down. It is likely the sugar and the insulin that is driving that small density pattern. And so very different than what we've kind of been taught with like, it's all about fat and cholesterol and this and that. It's likely the insulin and the sugar that's driving the dangerous pattern.
Fat also plays a role, though, like the types of fats that your diet is composed of primarily. Like saturated fats, we know reduce the amount of LDL receptors on the liver, on the surface of the liver, which can help, which obviously are important in terms of sucking back up those LDL particles before they have the opportunity to become small and dense. So I think for, especially for people who are genetically prone to dyslipidemia, like just being a little bit more conscious of like the fat composition of their diets.
Absolutely. And there's certainly genetic factors as well with this, where certain genetic phenotypes are going to respond worse to saturated fat in terms of how it's affecting their overall cholesterol levels. And so that's sort of a much deeper conversation. But I think kind of big picture, we probably need to be thinking deeper about LDL and what it means. And I'd like to see everyone, getting essentially a particle size test in the future, because I think it just helps us give a little bit more understanding of what's going on inside our bodies. And certainly also on the fat conversation, like the seed oil, the industrial seed oils and vegetable oils and these kind of crappy oils that we're eating in like massive quantities these days. These directly also lead to insulin resistance. They lead to problems with our mitochondria, oxidative stress that can generate the insulin resistance. So, that's another thing that we really want to get out of our diet to sort of promote our overall metabolic health and the cholesterol levels we want to see.
Yeah, I mean, seed oils are the worst. Just the processing of them. It's so intensive, and we don't have like the long-term data, like what it's like for a human being to be consuming such high amounts of these kinds of oils over the course of a lifespan, because they've only been in the modern food supply for what, like 40 years at this point?
Yeah. I think if anyone wants
Probably
to be
more
super
than that.
horrified.
50, 60 years
Yeah.
probably. But something, to that degree, like we just don't know the effect and the processing. It's like a horror show. You guys can go to YouTube. There's like, you can watch canola oil being made.
That was exactly what I was just going to say.
It's disgusting.
It's the worst of it. It's like a horror film,
Yeah.
basically. It's really bad. It'll make you never want to eat canola oil again.
So I know that, you're obviously co-founder Levels, all about personalized nutrition. But what are some like sort of general guidelines that you can give for people in terms of how to compose and think about their dietary pattern? I mean, is it like low carb diets for everybody, keto diets for everybody? Like what's the recommendation? Like where's the starting place? And then where can people go from there in terms of, catering their diets to their own individuality, their activity levels, performance needs, and so forth?
Yeah. So I think it's really hard to give like a blanket statement of what people should eat, because I do think it is quite personalized. But I think there's some principles that we can all use that can be helpful, which is really focusing on whole foods. Focus on clean foods that came from the earth, that are minimally processed, that are not covered in pesticides, and that hopefully come from good soil and are filled with nutrients. Like that's number one. Like
That's asking a lot, Casey.
I know. But that's like, if we can create like that being a primary, source, like really clean meats, clean proteins, clean plants, you're going to be 90% of the way there. Moving further than that, like, so that's what to put in. And then it's like what to take out. I mean, I would say the more we can minimize or eliminate the refined sugar, refined carbohydrates, and refined seed oils, like, again, that's going to take us a lot of the way there. And in terms of, other things that I think are quite valuable for the body, like in my opinion, fiber is a really, helpful thing for the human gut and for blood sugar control. So really, whole unprocessed foods, avoiding the ultra refined products that are in so many of our foods, and really supporting our microbiome with fiber and tons of healthy phytonutrients. Is kind of like the base of how I think, and where I think a lot of people in the nutrition space have kind of landed. I mean, people can quibble about like how much meat to eat and this and that, but I think like really clean foods that are as minimally processed as possible is the key to getting a lot of the way there. then in terms of refining, I think you can kind of take any dietary pattern. And so just to get back to your question, should everyone be keto? Should everyone be low carb? I don't necessarily feel that way. I'm not necessarily low carb or keto. I eat mostly, a plant's diet with some fish and eggs. The cool thing about monitoring is that you can actually take any dietary pattern that you do and optimize it. Like
Hmm.
when I used to be fully plant-based, and I put on a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, and realized that so many of the things that I thought were quite healthy were causing super big glucose spikes for me. The
Wow.
grains and, it was, I wasn't eating a lot of processed foods, but like a lot of the grains were causing huge glucose spikes for me, and the oatmeal and stuff like that. And so I got rid of some of those, found some grains like millet that, are sort of grain like things like millet that worked for me, cauliflower rice, broccoli rice. I can have all the same foods that I love, but I just use those alternatives. So finding out those like swaps that work for me. And then within like sort of just plants in general, figuring out which vegetables and which fruits cause the least glucose response. Like fortunately, there's lots of different varieties of these things. So pick the ones that actually work best for you. So that's sort of like optimizing sort of more of a plant-based diet, which again, I've sort of added in some animal products at this point. But if you're keto, it can also be really helpful for optimizing. There's a lot of keto people who are following like a super strict regimented keto diet and like, no, never touching like a bean and like never touching a carrot and never touching fruit because they think they need to really like, do none of that to stay in ketogenesis. Then they put a CGM on and they actually figure out they can liberalize their diet.
Wow.
They can add in the carrots. They can add in like a little bit of berries or maybe apple with almond butter or whatnot. And we've seen that a lot with the keto community, like actually loosening up a little because they realize they don't spike their glucose and it doesn't kick them out of ketogenesis because they're testing their ketones as well. And like everything's smooth sailing. Then there's people who, maybe don't do really well on a super hardcore ketogenic diet, but they don't do well with a ton of meat or whatnot. They know they do a little bit better with carbs. They still want to generate ketones for health purposes. And then they can actually dial in like fasting to basically buffer a little bit of a higher carb diet, but still be in ketogenesis, and being able to monitor that on a CGM like is really interesting. But yeah, same with, paleo, really any type of strategy that people have, like you can create little micro optimizations to get whatever benefit you get from that diet, how it aligns with your value system, but not have necessarily collateral damage of glucose spikes. So that's what I love about it. It's really diet agnostic and allows anyone to kind of refine what works for them.
We talked a lot about like the downside to having frequent and prolonged glucose spikes, but are there any benefits to occasionally spiking your glucose? I mean, to thyroid function, to leptin levels. Is there any reason why we might occasionally want to have a big carb rich meal?
Yeah. So the answer to this, like kind of, we look to sort of traditional cultures and animals as well, because there is a reason that, animals right before they hibernate eat a ton of fructose rich foods and ripe fruits and berries and things like that before they go and hibernate. It's because they literally want to store fat because they're not going to be eating for months at a time. So there are, and in certain indigenous, traditional cultures or indigenous cultures, where it's a little bit more of like feast or famine, being able to eat a lot of fructose, really drive forward some of those fat storage pathways, and then have that ability to have sort of energy stores, that can be a positive thing. In our modern world, in the Western world, that's not, we're sort of unfortunately have taken those evolutionary pathways that allow us to store energy in our body for times of need, and we've just like hijacked them, and we've given way too much substrate to those pathways, and now we're dealing with the ramifications of that. But I would say for people, if there are people who are looking to kind of like store energy, like a glucose spike and a lot of fructose in the body are going to drive some of those fat storage pathways. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's a good thing for the average modern American, but there is a very real evolutionary benefit of why we have glucose spikes and why that spikes insulin and why that leads to fat storage. And there's actually an amazing book coming out in a few months that I was able to review, which is called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, which is all about why it's evolutionarily advantageous for these pathways to work the way they do, but how our modern world is essentially unfortunately taking advantage of those. But in terms of just like general health benefits for having a glucose spike, there's none that I can really think of. I would say again, like the one spike here and there, like your body's designed to respond to it. It's not going to cause long-term damage. So no one should freak out about a single glucose
Yeah.
spike. It's really more the patterns over time.
I mean, I'm totally on the same page in terms of my own diet. I definitely eat a lower carb diet, although I definitely will enjoy, whole fruit. I've been going to town lately on like pineapple because I discovered tahine, which is like this Mexican spice with it's like a lime and salty, just amazing thing that you can sprinkle on watermelon, pineapple, mango. It's almost better than sex. It's the best thing ever. Um, my question is, that was a bit of a, I went to the Bahamas there, but my question is, so for people that like, is there a danger to demonizing blood sugar spikes for perhaps a certain population that might then avoid carbohydrates completely and then suffer health consequences from that? Like, there are a lot of women that follow me that don't really do as well on super low carb diets. So I wonder if like, you know, we run the risk of pathologizing carbohydrates and then sending the message that low carb diets are optimal, and then making a whole lot of people feel like miserable for it. And then also, of course, there's been some pushback from, communities like eating disorder, people with disordered eating and stuff like that. So I just want to address those two demographics, or for anybody else for whom, we want to make sure aren't suddenly becoming like scared of incorporating carbs into their life.
Yeah, it's such an important point. And the reality is like these are things we think about all the time as we're designing the product because it is nuanced. And I think people are often shocked when they hear that like the co-founder of this company is like a primarily plant-based person because they're like, wait, that's a lot of carbs. Like why, how does that align? And it's like we were just talking about, like you can absolutely make that work for a flat, pretty stable glucose response. It just takes a little bit of trial and error and kind of figuring out what foods actually work for your body. So I think the reality is that this does not need to drive people to like a keto or a super low carb diet. I think it will promote the idea that eating foods with refined carbs and refined sugar are leading to problems on the glucose monitor. And I do hope that they will help people avoid those foods because people don't really need to eat those. But a lot of foods with carbohydrates that have a good balance of fiber in them, like root vegetables and beans and legumes, like don't cause a glucose spike. And so I don't see this necessarily driving people away from those. And again, it's very variable person to person. But I, for instance, do not have a glucose spike of more than 10 points with beans, lentils, and several fruits, like fairly unripe pears, apples, things like that. So, so the monitor in a sense, like doesn't necessarily drive people to totally avoiding carbs.
So I think we kind of need to like uncouple this notion that carbohydrates cause glucose spikes. It's like certain carbohydrates for certain people
exactly
cause glucose spikes. And it's not just carbohydrates or even food for that matter that can lead to glucose spikes. Yeah. I think that's an amazing take home.
Yeah, I like to say like a carb in the mouth is not glucose in the bloodstream. Like it's like there's a whole lot that happens between a carbohydrate that goes in your mouth and what shows up in your bloodstream, like trillions of bacteria interacting with it and like a lot of complex physiology. So that is something that I think is important to remember. And but I think in terms of the refined stuff, which will most likely cause a glucose spike in most people, that is cool to be aware of and like to realize like that's not serving my goals. And maybe I can find a healthier, more whole foods alternative for that doesn't spike my glucose. But the question about eating disorders, like I think that's a really, really important one. And Peter T has a great episode on this, his AMA, about continuous glucose monitors because he's used them in patients for a long time. And he basically says he actually does not prescribe them to anyone who has a history of eating disorder because it can cause this sort of like fixation that, I haven't seen this actually happen in my own practice or with levels, but theoretically I can imagine it could cause one more thing to kind of fixate on and really, be harmful in that sense. What I will say is that we've seen actually more of the opposite of that, which is that people who have been focused on nutrition and finding the perfect diet and following every nutrition, book and influencer, and hasn't really been able to find the perfect diet for them or reach their health goals, that can be kind of an obsession. That's like kind of the orthorexia that people talk about, where it's like this obsession with wellness. And some of people who have sort of self-reported that that's what they've kind of been like 20 years of being obsessed with nutrition, put on a continuous glucose monitor, and in like a month they figure out, oh, these foods work for me and these foods don't seem to work for me. These combinations work for me, and walking after meals for 20 minutes really works for me. And then all of a sudden it's like poof, like I don't have to think about this as much anymore. I've actually, as opposed to taking everyone's advice and reading everything possible and trying to just like muddle through all this information, I've figured out these 10 new things that work well for me. That can actually be quite liberating. And I would say, for me personally, I think a lot less about food now than I did previously before wearing this. And the reason for that is because I sort of have in my mind the algorithm of what works and, you know, and what keeps my glucose stable. So in terms of things like weight or whatever, like it's not a mystery. Like I know what's going to, you know, serve the goals and what's not. And so there's two sides to the coin. One, which can be, I think, freeing and create efficiency in our nutrition journey, and one that can unfortunately kind of lead to a bit more focus and obsession on it. And so we have to just be really careful about, I think, you know, spreading that message, sharing that information, and making sure that the product itself, the software that create, really tries to guide people towards a really healthy experience with the food.
And I think it does. I mean, as I've said, I used Levels and I really enjoyed that 2-week period that I was using it for. I think what you're talking about really speaks to the fact that all new technologies really have an aspect to them that's like a double-edged sword. You know, it's just like fire. Fire can either cook your food or it can burn you. So I think it's about establishing a healthy relationship with these things. But at the end of the day, you know, I love this notion of the quantified self, right? Like what you can measure, you can manage and thus improve. And the more data, the better.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, you know, we are a black box, and it's really hard to control something that you don't understand. And unfortunately, the labs we get, the single time point measurements, make it very difficult to actually have understanding, because they're not a story. They're just a snapshot. Stories help us with understanding, and continuous variables like glucose creates a narrative and a story out of what's happening. And that allows us to have more understanding of our own bodies, be able to see within a little bit and make better decisions. And so that's what I'm hoping for people. And really the core mission of Levels is to help people understand how food's affecting their body and to empower individuals with their own information so they can make better decisions and have agency. And especially in the face of a lot of industries that, you know, really want us to eat their packaged processed foods and really benefit off us, you know, being sick and dependent on the system. I am really eager to empower people with their own information so that they can make their own independent, better decisions.
I love it. And I love the word that you keep using, agency. I think it's a really great word. Agency over one's health, I think, is something that, you know, people just don't feel this sense of agency. They feel like they're disempowered. They feel like they're victims. But really all it takes is a little bit of knowledge and to really turn that sentiment around. So grateful for what you guys are doing. What about like biohacker bro, you know, like that puts on a level CGM, and you know, they eat an apple, they see their blood sugar spike. They eat a piece of bacon, doesn't spike. They're like, okay, bacon's got to be better for me than the apple. Like, would that be a misunderstanding of the data, a misconstruing of the data from that?
Yeah, that is a situation that frankly, like it's a fear, you know, I have, that people are going to look at this and just say, oh my God, I'm in it. Like, cause if you think about it, like you could literally drink a gallon of canola oil and like your glucose won't spike.
Right.
And so like, is that the new optimal diet? Like,
right. Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting question. Are glucose spikes? So, I mean, like, yeah, glucose spikes, we know are not the end all be all metric arbiter measure of a food's healthiness. But, you know, just going back to the person who, you know, doesn't fully understand the implications of what this data is telling them, they'll eat a delicious Honeycrisp apple. And I'm not making a qualitative judgment against bacon. I love bacon. But is that kind of like a switch that, you know, that you might endorse based on the data to come from a CGM?
Well, there's two things here that I think are important. The first is that this is why education is such a key part of our program. We talk a lot about like the goal is not necessarily to like rig the game, like to win the game by just having a flat and stable glucose line. The goal, like winning the game, is having a body that is metabolically healthy and that has like the cellular machinery that processes energy effectively. And so while minimizing glucose spikes is a part of that, it's not like at all costs type of thing. So we educate tons like in our app about the microbiome and about micronutrients and about environmental toxins and about oxidative stress and all these things so that people can understand the full picture of these things. Like sure, that was a flat glucose spike because you chugged the canola oil, but like there's, the oxidative stress is going to, over the long term, damage the mitochondria and lead to metabolic dysfunction in the long run. It's the same with like micronutrients. Like you need all these little tiny like vitamins and minerals, manganese and magnesium and zinc and vitamin C. Like they literally serve as lock and key cofactors for the proteins that process glucose in our cells. It's so cool. But you might not necessarily realize on the glucose monitor, like I need to be optimizing for micronutrients because you don't see it show up immediately. It's
Right.
over the weeks and months and years that it matters. And so that's an education piece. But the second cool thing is that like, this is where the future of biosensors is going. The future of biosensors is going to be multi-molecule biosensors. Right now, the only molecule we can measure on the body is glucose. It's the only one that exists. Like to actually, you have a sensor on your body and it's giving you that data. And it's a great step forward, but like diet is not just about glucose. It's about all these other things. And so multi-molecule sensors, which are certainly right around the corner, are going to be able to kind of disambiguate some of these things that we're talking about. So let's say you do eat the canola oil, maybe it doesn't show up on the glucose, test, but what if we had that test for oxidative stress? What if we had the test for cytokines that are showing our acute inflammatory stress response? What if we had some sort of molecule that we could test that shows like about leaky gut or like, something in that realm? Then you could start to say, okay, it didn't spike my glucose, but it caused all these other problems. Like an example of this is that fructose, like straight fructose, which is causing huge amounts of problems in America, primarily hurting our livers because fructose drives fatty liver disease and makes our livers insulin resistant through like a glucose independent pathway. Fructose doesn't actually stimulate. It will not increase glucose or insulin on your glucose monitor. Now, almost all the foods we eat with fructose also have glucose in them. Like high fructose corn syrup is usually like half glucose. So you will see a glucose spike, but fructose itself isolated will not spike glucose or insulin. So you could potentially be eating straight fructose, going down the pathway of metabolic dysfunction, and it wouldn't show up on a CGM. But
it'll jack your triglycerides.
You could check your triglycerides, or uric acid is actually downstream of fructose. As fructose gets processed in its pathway in the cell, it generates uric acid, which is actually something we can measure on a finger prick now or in a lab, not continuous yet. But you can imagine if you had a uric acid monitor along with your glucose monitor on the same little sensor, you'd be able to now disambiguate sort of like those types of foods. And so that's where I really see things going, where you have a dashboard where it's like, okay, this food had this type of impact on my body. And it's not just about glucose. So that's what I'm really excited to see. And I think what levels will emerge as is really the software layer to put that type of stuff together. But I think we're going to see some really exciting stuff in the next 2 to 5 years with multi-molecule sensors that help essentially answer that question about bacon and the apple. Like, maybe the bacon didn't cause a glucose spike, but maybe it caused your free fatty acids to go to like a really unhealthy level or something like that.
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm just like thinking about just drinking canola oil and it makes me queasy. It's so gross. And just to underscore what you said earlier in the episode, which I think is so important, it's that metabolic dysfunction. It's blood sugar specifically, fasting blood sugar. It's a lagging indicator of what could be 13 years, you said, of just doing things wrong.
Yeah.
Eating the wrong diet, living the wrong way. And at that point, I mean, think about all the damage that potentially has already been done on your organs, but also on your skin, on your brain.
Blood vessels. Yeah, exactly. So we gotta start catching these things early. And I think it's gonna really got to get doctors on board with like thinking this way from like that pre-disease root cause approach, and not just focused on like, you know, feeling like success criteria is diagnosing and treating. Like that's not success criteria in treating. Success criteria is preventing and reversing. And we've got to shift gears for more doctors to be focusing that way.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Like if you're eating avocados, nuts, eggs, you know, you put a little butter in your coffee, like you're just not snacking, like you're full. And that's what I think is nice, especially with so many people working from home right now. The refrigerator is just like 2 steps away for a lot of people, right? And we've seen the data now coming out with lockdowns and all that. A lot of people gained weight, you know, and the overweight and the obese gained more weight than the people who weren't overweight and obese. Studies have shown that, right? So